There seems to be an awful lot of sad stories in the news today, and there are thousands missing. Does anybody care? New Band Channel, where we talk about those faces. Talking news with Debbie. Cassie Barnes has still not been found, and it's been 2 years since her case first hit the spotlight. Breaking. Chattanooga and Lori Vallow both behind bars. Sarah Galloway was found. She wasn't found alive. What happened to Sarah Galloway?
It's too heartbreaking to share.
Children are still missing. Children like Dorsey. You're in shame. You just got away with it. Welcome to Talking News. Hello everyone. My name is Debbie. We use big stories to push little faces.
Chasing a murder.
Hello everyone, welcome to Chasing a Murder Talking News. Today we are doing a Chasing a Murder episode, and it's going to be part 46 of Life Beyond the Grave, attached to the Lori Vallow case. And we are going to go ahead and jump right in. I think some of this information I'm sharing today is very important to understand how their belief system become so surreal, I guess you should say. In 2015, Chad is very excited to see Julie Rowe's books selling off the shelves at Siegel Bookstore. Chad writes in a blog that her books were featured 13 straight times in the Siegel book catalogs. He said this is something that is almost unheard of. Now, something I want to mention before we get started is the fact that Julie Rowe seems to be mixing old magic, Christianity, Mormonism, and modern energy healing into one belief system. Actually, let's go ahead and cover some of the visions of the future by Julie Rowe. Julie writes, I continue to look into the window of heaven. I witnessed many national events that have since taken place, as well as several that will happen in the near future. The nation is still experiencing economic trouble, and there will be a small-scale natural disasters, but for the most part, there wasn't anything to signal major problems ahead. So let's pause there for a moment and notice how they used the LDS leaders to support their thoughts, their predictions. So let's continue. During this time, the leaders of the LDS Church scheduled a special meeting concerning preparedness that was broadcast. They also sent letters to stake presidents asking them to determine what supplies the saints had and how much food storage they had. So meetings were held where local leaders passed out a list asking church members to indicate the supplies they had available if needed. The list included axes, hammers, food storage, blankets, sanitary supplies, fabric, clothing, hose, rakes, nails, horses, cows, and more. These meetings enabled church leaders to determine which families and their wards and stakes are temporarily prepared, as well as determining those who were spiritually willing to share their possessions with others. Then, the invitation came from the prophet for the church members to gather at the camps that had been prepared as places of refuge. Some of these were previously established girl camps, while other locations were church-owned properties that have not been fully developed yet. This invitation wasn't a surprise at all to the saints who had already been involved in the previous meetings on preparedness, but it came as a shock to the majority of members of the church. Most refused to even consider the idea of leaving their homes. Only a small percentage of the members went to camps, either because they did not have the faith or they were not prepared. Now, something I want to pause here and explain to you is What we're told is if ever the prophet calls upon people to gather and you haven't prepared and you don't have supplies, you cannot go to these camps. So just keep that in mind. Within an hour of the prophet's invitation, everything was put into motion. White semi trucks came, and they were loaded with supplies and food storage before traveling to the camps. I noticed that the circumstances in the United States were not that bad. People were still working, going to school, and performing their normal daily activities. There was still power and electricity and cars still on the road. So let's pause there. So this is stuff that Lori Vallow is reading. Though it's presented as fiction, a lot of them understand that they have to do this in order to be accepted by the church and not to be excommunicated. In most cases, people reading these books see it as nonfiction. They are warnings by great seers. So I'm going to continue reading some of this. Actually, there's 14 pages. And I don't think we're going to be able to do all that, but we'll kind of skip through it and see what I can share. Now, she gives you an idea of how the gathering begins within the LDS. And they say that the faithful saints across the country will heed to the prophet's invitation. So the prophet will start calling on people to gather when that time comes. She continues writing that the saints throughout the western states began gathering as they have been instructed. And I also saw hundreds of people driving from the eastern states of Kansas City area. They usually traveled in caravans, and some had two-way radios to communicate with other vehicles. So that seems a little realistic, because if you lose communication for any reason whatsoever through satellite, you can still communicate through CB radio. She describes that she sees campers with SUVs and smaller cars following behind, all heading to the safety of these camps. And the one thing all these people have in common is they have been organized very well for a very long time. And partially due to the fact that they have been given strict counsel and guidelines for their trips and how to be prepared for heading to the camps during the gathering process. Julie describes that they would actually follow very specific and similar routes to get to these destinations. Over the course of about a few weeks, many of these people end up gathering safely at the camps, and as time gets further through the 2 weeks, things become more dangerous and urgent. And at the very end there, while most had made it safely to the camps, she wrote, many left too late and did not make it to their destination. So we don't know what happens to them. So here's something that Chad Daybell, Julie Rowe, and many of the Doomsday authors discuss, including David Warwick. They believe during this time, as the LDS gathered to the camps, especially the West Coast, there will be foreign invading the USA, and that the people in the camps will see military helicopter jets and airplanes flying over much of the United States, especially the West Coast. There will be police officers and military personnel patrolling the streets all over the United States and setting up checkpoints for limited travel throughout the country. So let's think about this. If you are a LDS member and you have entirely 100% faith in whatever you hear through this religion, including people like Julie Rowe, would this be scary for you? Imagine thinking that something like this is coming true. And they're really not. They give you small hints that it's not going to happen anytime soon, but the majority of it insinuates it's going to happen sooner than later. Julie also says, in response to all this chaos starting to happen, she sees families hiking with packs into the mountains. Many of them hiked for great distances. Others did not have as far to go. But she sees these people setting up their own camps and tents. Once many of these people reached the main camps, they immediately began to set up their tents, campsites, and have been assigned to them. She says, I saw people taking care of their children, making campfires, cooking meals, singing and dancing around the campfires, and talking to one another. So this is a big deal to a lot of the preppers. Many times they'll have their little gatherings or group. I don't know how to title it correctly, but these preppers will get together sometimes, and a lot of times they do it by campfires, and they discuss their visions and their warnings. Okay, let's talk about how Julie Rowe sees her family. She says, my family departs for the camps. I then was shown my own family's journey from our homes to the places of refuge. We were assigned a particular camp in the Rocky Mountains. We traveled from Kansas City area, which she lived at sometime at one point, in a southern direction to avoid Denver, which had become too dangerous for travelers. I'm going to skip the rest of this, but she talks about how she alternates routes through several states in the West, headed to Utah, and that she and her family finally arrive to the safety of the Rocky Mountains, okay? So they're giving you an idea of where their safe haven is. In the beginning of this case, when they heard these words like Zion, they were like, where are these places? So Julie actually mentions that they're in Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and Washington. But she says she sees camps in her vision in Florida and the Northeast as well. In Julie's vision, she claims that she has an aerial view of the United States. And there she can see the various camps scattered throughout the country. And she has been shown personally that the Lord will gather the righteous saints to protect and spare them prior to the worst of the devastation and destruction to come. Then the cleansing will begin. So you got to remember Lori Vallow's world at this time, she's starting to read these types of books. And she's starting to believe that there's destruction, there's devastation, and that the most evil will be cleansed and only the righteous will remain. Not only is she seeing, these teachings, she's also seeing that many people are getting quite popular by writing books about visions, predictions, and it would only get worse for us, but for Lori, more exciting as she starts to see these people become more popular through podcasts, and all attached to what she knows most, the LDS belief system. Her whole entire life was based on being part of the Mormon church. But now there's this new group of people coming out, kind of steering people as if they are great messengers. So very big deceivers. The people and the warnings that you get from the teachings of the LDS, to steer clear of the wolves and sheep clothing. Julie describes that there are 3 types of camps, and that she is shown there will be distinct differences between tent cities, places of refuge, city of light. All 3 camps involve people living in tents, but tent cities was a general term for groups of people who gathered together when things got rough. And then she mentions what rough means. So due to famine, pestilence, martial law, invasions, and a few other things. And to me, this just adds more fear for people like Lori Vallow and many others like her who go into a panic mode when they hear or read about this stuff, destroying many lives. So back to Julie's description of these camps. These camps consisted of groups of non-LDS people, although there would be some members of the church who did not heed the prophet's call to go to places of refuge prepared and organized by the church. So her writing here is a little bit kind of hard to figure out. But she starts describing one of the camps, being known as places of refuge, where it's one step above tent cities. They are organized by the church leadership, and for the most part, the saints were assigned to specific locations. So remember, when we hear Zion in the story, especially at the beginning, we're thinking of one place. But it's not necessarily at all one place. It can be multiple places in one area or spread throughout. Anyway, she says this camp is mainly made up of active members of the LDS Church, but in some cases, there were non-members who were allowed to join the community. So the righteous who have not accepted the LDS faith. Then she mentions cities of light, represented a whole different level. These are also organized by the church and were places where the saints were gathered with the intention to eventually live the law of the consecration. In these cities of light, tent tabernacles and small courtyards will be built for temple worship in the wilderness. As in the days of Moses, pillars of smoke were over the tabernacles by day, and pillars of fire hovered above them at night. So this is insinuating that all electricity's gone, you're out in the middle of nowhere, and your light sources are going to be that of fire and natural light. Sorry for the background noise, guys, because I'm still not at home. Julie describes that there are few cities of light compared to the total number of tent cities. In fact, she mentions that many of these tent cities will evolve and develop into cities of light over time. And from all of these little groups, the city of light, the tent cities, there are people that will be called back to establish what is called New Jerusalem or Zion, and she says it's in Jackson County, Missouri. And she mentions the fact that not everyone will be called back to Jackson County. So you got to remember, people like Lori Vallow, who like to be the center of attention with the top people, this is going to mean a lot to her. So what is she going to have to do to be part of the ones that is called to Jackson, to Zion? So now we may have an idea of how Lori Vallow is thinking. So Julie Rowe has actually detailed that there's 3 different camps. She goes into giving us details about those, but really kind of starts to fade away from that and starts talking about the discord in the camps. She doesn't give us much detail on this stuff, so she doesn't say much about Zion. She doesn't say much about any of it. Her main focus is to warn of disaster, so that's what I've got from her. So she says, discord and camps. Some people who originally came to the places of refuge ended up leaving of their own accord. And on occasion, there are some who are escorted out and forced to leave the camps because of disobedience. Many of the reasons also include stirring up trouble, false teachings, and unwillingness to live the higher law, and so on. Julie claims in her vision that some lost faith and just merely give up. So after reading some of her work, I was very, very much amazed that people were interested or could keep reading it. So quickly, Julie Rowe actually mentions some magical powers, which is important. She says children are born. People were healed from terrible sickness and disease. And in some cases, people were raised from the dead. I found it very interesting that she's not mentioned exactly who is responsible for doing all of this are these miracles and magic. And then she mentions something that is quite understandable, that there are some people who died in the camps and others did not. Now here's something that's very interesting. You need to know this part because you got to remember a lot of this is going to be based on warrior status as well. So you're a warrior of God, literally, wielding guns, whatever you have to in order to protect the camps. And a few people, you will hear their names attached to this, which is Jason Mao and a few others, guys, and we'll go into that later, like to mention guns and fighting as a warrior of God. So this is something Julie also mentions every now and then, but she's very careful how she selects words. So she says there's some who are asked to defend the faith, protect the camps, and in many cases fight for freedom. And then she mentions again how the first seasons of camping seem to last a year or two, and there are some reorganization of the camps and they combine into larger groups. So guys, I'm going to try to throw in some timeline, but some of this information is there's a lot of it. And so it's taken up some of our timeline, but I feel it's important for you to hear this so that you can understand the story in detail as we move forward. Julie Rowe talks about a close-up view of the tabernacle. And this is still her vision. She says, as she looked down upon the United States, she saw land become dark, except for spots of light in different parts of the country. This is both literally and figuratively. Ouch, I got a bug on me. All right, sorry about that, guys. So, and she says, where is my spot? I could see a few places of refuge in Colorado, and at least one in the state of Washington. I saw several camps in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. So she's repeating here. Most of the tent cities in Utah were in the northern part of the state. This is where a few near, I don't know how you pronounce this, it's Moab, I'm going to say Moab, and St. George. So a lot of the Preparing the People conferences and stuff are, you'll notice, held at places like St. George. She does a lot of speaking there, so a lot of preppers like those areas. She then claims that some areas just had a mellow light around them, while other areas were glowing with what looked like small fire, which I felt were the cities of light. I find her choice of words there intriguing because here she is very confident of what the cities of light are and where they are, but here she's like, well, I feel as. Feeling and knowing, that's different. Now, this next paragraph insinuates that she's not even on Earth when she's seeing this view. She's actually somewhere outside of Earth. She doesn't say, at least not at this time. She said, I then began to move toward Earth. The view narrowed into one of the camps. As the scenery grew closer, I saw white tents and several other tents of varying colors. Off to the side of the camp, there was a huge white tent. Let's skip a little bit. She says, it looked similar to the pictures of the tabernacle the Jews had while wandering in the wilderness with Moses, although there was no altar in the courtyard area. I could see a very bright light above it, and it looked as though the fire was coming out of the top of the tent, but it was hovering in place. The thought came to me that this was indeed a temporary temple. I saw people dressed in white clothing standing near the entrance of the tent, as if they were guarding it. There was a fence surrounding the perimeter, and 2 armed men were outside the fence, guarding the area. I saw a man and a woman enter the tent after talking to a man dressed in white who was standing near the entrance. I heard the words, temple work, and the scene ended. So they have their own little guards carrying guns around in these tent cities. In fact, one of her visions that she shares says she can see her husband carrying a gun while on horseback. So she's given us several accounts of what she sees these camps looking like. She said her view panned out again, and she was looking at the United States from the sky again. I knew that the fire represented the presence of the Spirit of the Lord at these places. I am not sure how many of there were because the scene did not last long. And by the time I realized what I was looking at, I did not count them. And she liked saying, assuming and describing how she doesn't understand the exact images she saw. So that's the way she does this oftentimes. Or she'll say the angels, won't allow me to share what I know. It's just, to me, I have a lot of questions about her claim to be a messenger. Because in my opinion, based on my research, she has destroyed a lot of lives with this stuff. Let's continue what she saw. Another view of the camp. Then I zoomed in on a different camp filled with dozens of tents. It seemed later in the year. I saw people dressed in warm fall clothing, preparing campfires, fixing food, and cleaning around the campsites. Some were not adequately dressed for the chilly weather. They were wearing lighter clothing, which was more fit for summer weather. Off to the side of the camp, there was a huge white tent again. The best way I can describe it is that it was a huge rectangle with a vaulted roof, like a very large wall tent. This one had a rock wall surrounding it about 3 feet high. There were guards dressed in regular street clothes standing outside of the fenced area. This time I did not see anyone in the doorway of the temple, nor did I see anyone going inside. There was a pillar of smoke hovering in the air above the tents. It looked like a small gray cloud. I later saw that winter had come. It was very cold and snowy. It was extremely difficult, especially for those who had not brought warm clothing with them. There were fires to help keep people warm, and it was very cold and windy. So again, a bunch of nonsense that just really isn't impressive at all, in my opinion. We're going to skip past this. She says she saw 4 or 5 men on horseback, and they were switching shifts with the other priesthood men who were armed and guarding the surrounding mountain areas. Some men were keeping watch several miles away, and others were stationed around the perimeter of the camp, out of sight of the children, but close enough that they could warn and protect the area. So again, another mention of guns, guards, and being scared, having to protect our children, our families from something very dark. But we don't know what it is. And Lori Vallow, this is something she talks about quite often. So this is why I'm going over all this, so that people can have the details they need in order to evolve and understand the story. Sorry guys, we're going to have a little bit of background noise from here on. So these books are quite popular by near-death experience authors attached to the LDS, and they are just growing more popular as time pushes forward. And Lori continues to read, those books, and in one of these books, Julie's vision, she says she saw her husband, Jeff. At the time, she's divorced now, but her first husband was one that was called upon to keep watch of the camp. She saw him sitting high in a tree overlooking the area not far from the camp. Later, she sees him mounting a horse with a rifle in his hand, leaving with 2 other men to travel to a greater distance from the camp so that they can keep guard. So she sees herself and her husband kind of being some of the protectors of these group of people. Julie being a messenger of God, and her husband actually being called upon to protect godly people and godly messengers. And you can't help but to wonder if some of these people are thinking, wow, if this is coming, how do I become part of this elite group? Because Julie makes these people out to be so grand. Because after being shown all these people and some of their trials and tribulations, she says she quickly came to a much greater appreciation for them and for her own life. And one of the most popular sayings that comes from her mouth is, "It was made known to me that those who lived up to their foreordained missions in life, especially those who suffer and are basically martyred for Christ's sake, will receive eternal glory we cannot now perceive, and that all will be made right with the Lord in time." As Julie Rowe's name starts to become more popular within the LDS community, because most people have no idea who she is, more people draw to her and start listening to what she has to say. And there's a few things that actually raise a red flag for me, but we'll talk more about it later. But I'm going to do a quick mention at this time. She will talk about past lives, and that many of us live multiple lives. And here's the problem. When she speaks about her past lives, and a lot of people also attached to her and her group, they all seem to have been somebody very important in the past. There are lives beyond the grave, guys. And pretty soon, in a few years from now, she will have something to say about other people claiming the rights to know other people's past, their pre-mortal existence, as well as their past lives. And she will shout out to the world that these are wolves in sheep clothing, okay? They're deceivers, they're liars, they're Satan. That she is one of the few that are in the light of God. So, but in 2015, she's just now getting the courage up to be a little more open. So she's not gotten to that point yet. In fact, the blood moon is approaching, as we've mentioned in past podcasts. And she has a lot to say about that. Don't forget that this raises the eyebrows of the church leaders. They're starting to give her the side eye. They're not certain whether or not they are wanting to allow her to continue to address them as part of her discussions. Because there are many followers of the church and members that are definitely not happy with the teachings of Julie Rowe. They think that they are teachings that have nothing to do with anything attached to the Mormon. It's enough complaints that leaders do end up writing a letter, which we'll talk about later. So I want to mention, during this time, Lori Vallow's niece that will be attached to this case is married to Brandon Boudreaux. Not going to go into too much detail like I would like, because there's really not much to talk about, especially now. We'll talk more about her as we get deeper into the case. But she seems to have a normal life. She enjoys running marathons. She has several kids. They like to have, better things in their life. And Melanie Boudreaux is actually trying to work her way closer to the Cox family. This includes Lori Vallow. She's not that close with Lori during this period in time, but she is working her way towards that place. So we don't hear anything crazy going on from Melanie Boudreaux during this time in her life. Everything seems normal. Okay, guys, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to end it here. And then we'll start talking more about the blood moon, Chad Daybell, and Lori Vallow, and 2015 on part 47 of Life Beyond the Grave. I put a few Easter eggs in this one. Thank you so much for your support. I love you guys, and I'll see you guys soon.